it's really about, talking about the funding issues, and we had, there's not enough funding from philanthropy, from government, to make sure that we're getting the right capital into communities. And why is this urgent now? Why is it important? So we'll spend half an hour up here to talk about that. It's supposed to be one whole hour, and we'll see how that works, because we really want it to be a conversation so that you can also join in the conversation, you can ask questions, and we can create more of a learning experience for us all to see what really works, what doesn't work, and how we can move this conversation forward. So maybe just before I move up there to introduce the panelists, one of the three things I think was said in the morning about acting quickly and looking at proven solutions. And last night we had about the challenges on climate and how this needs to be a continuous conversation for all of us. So to quantify this urgency, I was looking at some of the figures, is that the financing needed to meet the sustainable development goals seems further out of reach in terms of the global crisis. And one of the most recent estimates suggests that by 2025, financing worth $3.7 trillion will be needed in emerging markets and developing economies other than China, rising to US $5.9 trillion in 2030. So I hope that that sets the content in terms of the urgency and quantifying the problem that we are looking at and how we can get more financing and scale up solutions that we face in the society today. I'll move over here to introduce the panelists. Arif, can you hear us now? So I'll start with Dr. Frank Aswani, who's seated right next to me. So Dr. Frank Aswani is the CEO of Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, a network of social investors who are collaborating to increase the flow of impact into social investments across Africa and ensure that the capital is deployed for maximum social impact. He's played many roles, and I think we'll be here all afternoon if I talk about the many accomplishments that Frank has had. But one thing that I learned this morning is he also runs a podcast, Afro Impact. So really telling the conversations and the stories when it comes to impact investments and looking at African solutions by Africa. He's also on a number of boards, and is a member of the investment committee of the Mastercard Foundation Africa Growth Fund. Next to Frank, we have Chloe Edelston. Chloe is a manager at Social Finance International team. She has worked on a number of development impact bonds, including the Cameroon Kangaroo Mother Care Development Impact Bond, as a performance management advisor, as well as an employment development impact bond in Palestine. And she has extensive experience in designing and implementing other outcome-based approach, and has worked with ICRC, Bill and Melinda Gates, and Save the Children to create their innovative financing strategy. So, welcome. Online we have Arif Neki. Arif, can you hear us? Arif, are you able to unmute? As Matilda helps with that. Arif wears two hats. He's the senior advisor at the UN Strategic Partnerships of the Resident Coordinator's Office and the National Coordinator of the SDG Partnership Platform in Kenya, co-created by the UN system and the government of Kenya. He also represents the UN Resident Coordinator as the alternate of the UN Global Compact Network Kenya Board and is the chairman of the Standing Board Committee in Programs. Arif has extensive experience when it comes to impact investing, and he was also the co-founder of the East Africa Philanthropy Network that we are here today because of them.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making time to join us. So I lead EAPC. I'm Kenyan, living in Johannesburg. I've been doing this particular role for the past 4 years. So what I want to start off with is the problem we're trying to solve. And I always say we should fall in love with the problem, not our solutions. Because the solutions are many. And the solution today could be obsolete tomorrow. So fall in love with the problem we're trying to solve. So the problem we're trying to solve is how do we support Africa to attain sustainable financing towards, especially at a macro level, it's SDGs, and at a micro level, impact, innovation, and SMEs on the ground that are playing a critical role in closing some of the gaps that governments, for example, cannot fulfill. We are a Pan-African network of impact investors, mobilizing and deploying grants that are equity into the impact space. We have our headquarters in Nairobi, offices in Johannesburg and Lagos, and we are part of a 4 global network of sister organizations. We've got sister networks in Asia, Latin America, and Europe. And we support investors to work up in different ways. One, we run some training programs through our Leadership Development Center. So we do, for example, an annual impact investing fellowship program with faculty from Oxford. It's in third year now. In the second year, we were asked to design an impact investing program for healthcare funders. So we've got a healthcare funders forum. We've just got a grant now, a month and a half ago, to design another program for climate finances. And we continue building depth of training programs in line with thematic priorities of the continent. There's also 3 other really exciting programs we'll be doing. One of them is, I don't know if you have heard of an organization called the Catalytic Capital Consortium. We've just got a grant to run Africa's first catalytic investment training program that should be starting sometime in September. And we're also going to be exploring the concept of catalytic pool funds. I'll talk a bit about that.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks, Mariam, for that great introduction. And thanks all for coming. I know this is a tough slot at the end of the day after a delicious lunch, so really appreciate your presence. So I'm Chloe, I work for social finance. I'm based in Nairobi, but the rest of my team is actually based in London. And social finance is one of many organisations in this space that has a name that tells you literally nothing about what they actually do. So maybe I'll start by sort of talking a bit about what social finance does. Our main objective is to really put outcomes at the heart of international development, and we try and do that in 3 different ways. So the first is through cross-sector partnerships. I think what we're trying to do and what most of you are trying to do here is really difficult, and you need to bring as many people around the table as possible. And so we really work at the intersection of government, development partners, to a certain extent the private sector, as well as philanthropy and service providers themselves. The second thing the second sort of tool in our toolkit or approach is outcomes-based approaches, and that's probably what we're the best known for. We designed and implemented the first ever impact bond in the UK back in 2010, and we've been a key partner in sort of spreading the approach across different sectors and different geographies since then. And finally, I guess an increasing part of our work is actually around innovative finance, and by that I mean thinking of new ways to deploy and combine different sources of funding, whether that's public or private sources of funding. And so yeah, I think I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and perhaps we can try Arif now.
Arif, can you try? Try to speak.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Just confirming that you can hear me.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, Arif.
So, colleagues, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the organizers, Evans and East Africa Philanthropy Network, for inviting me. I hope that you can hear me clearly from Nairobi. A few hours before getting on the flight to Zanzibar, I took a COVID-19 test, and unfortunately, I tested positive, so I have to stay back, which is why I'm not there physically. So I am the Senior Advisor for Strategic Partnerships at the UN system in Kenya, and I'm the founding coordinator of what's called the SDG Partnership Platform, which was previously established as an SDG Philanthropy Platform. Previously, I'm a banker. I ran Societe Generale in 14 countries in East Africa, and I ran the Aga Khan Foundation as regional CEO for East Africa for 14 years. Delighted to be here, and happy to be with my good friends Frank Aswani and Chloe. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you, Arif. While we have you online, and if you can hear me, I think you're going to kick off the conversation for us. And you know, the first question we were talking about, the institutions, but also trying to reflect on some of the opportunities and challenges when it comes to innovative financing. And in particular, what strategies and mechanisms can innovation funding employ, for example, to support dynamic and innovative model that can be effectively scaled up? Can you hear us?
Are you addressing the question to me, William? Can I speak?
Yes, you can speak. You can kick us off and then we'll move to Dr. Frank.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. I think this is a very important and exciting subject. I mean, the approaches that you ask about, for us at the SDG Partnership Platform, catalytic financing is an important element in a much broader response to an evolving context in many African countries, including Kenya and most East African countries, which are emerging as middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries. And this is obliging us as ODA shrinks and grant funding shrinks to think much more about the Secretary General's call for transition based funding. What this means is that to continue our development impacts in the long term, we need to be embracing this whole opportunity of creating financing flows, investments, and embracing larger pots of capital, including private sector capital. Some of the opportunities in this evolving context have been, for example, for us in Kenya, we've seen the whole United Nations system with 24 funds, agencies, and programs. Last year's spend will be about $450 million a year, whereas government budgets are about $30 billion, but mostly constrained by debt finance and debt service. And so we're looking at the private sector market for capital, and we're looking at a $90 billion market out there. So can we use philanthropic capital to capitalize and unlock private capital and ultimately government co-funding and government capital as we move in this transition from SDG funding to finance? I think it's an imperative, but it's also an opportunity. We also have seen now that multi-stakeholder partnerships through co-creation can make this happen. There is a huge push and paradigm in Africa to bring partners together. No single agency or institution or sector is a silver bullet to our SDGs and our development goals. philanthropy, once again, it is quite well positioned to catalyze such partnerships with its potential agility, its values, its desire for locally led development, and its credibility. So as we think about this, how do we make transformative and sustainable investments and financing happen that create longer term sustainability? The experience that we had in the SDG Partnership Platform, which was originally set up as a philanthropy platform, supported by the Hilton Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and MasterCard Foundation, and more recently, Rockefeller Foundation, is that we work at sort of macro ecosystem level, which is to bring private sector, philanthropy, civil society partners, academia, government, and development partners all together in a common ecosystem on the ground. And as we did this, and we were launched in the UN General Assembly in 2017 to transform from a philanthropy platform to a partnership platform, we embraced this role of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And the focus, therefore, is to create investments, financing, and partnerships that drive both economic impacts but also social impacts on a shared value basis, which allow us to unlock that huge pool of 90 billion private capital to try and ensure that it's profit with purpose or shared value investments, which allow philanthropy to play a leading role in terms of the seed funding for designing, testing, and unlocking some of these capital flows. In terms of approach, we've focused on 6 key work streams, which include ecosystem building. So we've brought in a number of other partnerships through private sector and philanthropy, including working with East Africa Philanthropy Network, which I had the privilege of being the co-founder almost 20 years ago. The Impact Invest in Kenya, which is the National Advisory Board of all the financing sector in Kenya, the banks, private equity, venture capital, philanthropy, social enterprises, angel investors, pensions, cooperatives, bringing in the partners like the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, the UN Global Compact, the Agriculture Sector Network, the Healthcare Federation. So the idea is to create more structured partnerships with private sector and philanthropy that go beyond this transactional relationship we had in the past. And the challenges, of course, that you have asked about include fragmentation. It includes a lot of traditional project and pilot-based approaches, which don't help reduce fragmentation. The need to align to common national targets and institutional branding. Oftentimes, we need to build trust across sectors, trust between private and public sectors. And that's where a lot of these platforms, networks, and philanthropic initiatives can play an important role in deepening trust across these sectors. So in short, what we need is to create on-the-ground common ecosystems for multi-stakeholder partnerships, where philanthropy can play a very strong leading role to unlock catalytic funding. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif, and I'm sure the audience will like to also know a little bit more about partnerships, and we can delve into that a little bit later in the conversation. But it'd be good to hear also, Dr. Aswani, your reflections on the same, and particularly touching on how we could drive systems change, which has been that conversation.
And so, the other thing that I want us to also be very realistic about is in the 60 or so years of independence of the continent, we've been very reliant on aid. And the harsh reality we must all wake up to is aid to Africa is declining. Aid to Africa has fallen faster than the US global giving has grown. Okay? So this continent where we've dealt and depended so much on aid, we've got to think differently. And if the aid is at about maybe, estimates say about between $25 and $40 billion a year at the moment. Our government tax revenues are at about, give or take, $500 million a year. Our SDG financing gap is, depending on who you talk to, about $2.5 trillion a year. So we've got a big gap that we have to fill. The other sources of money and things like diaspora remittances, which are about, in fact, we're talking about this, they're about $100 billion a year. So we get almost 3 times from our brothers and sisters who are not in our countries than we get from aid. And so when you look at that, we've got to think, how do we close the gap between all of this money and the $2.5 trillion? And that's what we need to think about options of funding. And the biggest option I think you need to look at is private capital markets. Because to close the SDGs globally, we need about $4.5 trillion. And global financial markets are $450 trillion. So we just need 1% of the global capital available to solve our SDGs. So if you think about it, the world is not short of money or short of risk capital. Capital to test new markets, new products, new services, innovate, pay for innovation, and that's the big difference that philanthropy brings. We're the only ones in this room who sit on capital that is attracted to risk. In fact, in the equation of moving capital, no one is more important today if we're going to crowd in private capital to the impact space than philanthropists. But it means a mindset shift. It means a shift from big traditional philanthropists who ask to be catalytic investors. So this is probably one of the most important sessions we could sit through in the course of this conference. And the difference is, if you're a traditional philanthropist, you've got $1 million, you'll get $1 billion as grants. As a catalytic investor, you're asking yourself, for every dollar I give out, how much dollars of private capital especially am I crowding into this space? Is it 5, is it 10, is it $20? How am I attracting private capital into this space? And the mindset shift that we have to drive is in the development space, that sector is not only designed to absorb grants. And in the private capital space is that profit and purpose are not mutually exclusive. Just because you're doing something developmental doesn't mean you're losing money as a private capital player. So there's certain mindset shifts we need to bring. And one of the biggest approaches we also have to think about is, do we have the right human capital in Africa to drive the change? Okay, because we're trying to bridge the divide between philanthropy and private capital and play in this middle space of impact investing, innovative finance, the kind of clever stuff that Chloe does. And the sad thing, I don't know if you know this, but the whole continent of Africa has only one university that teaches impact and sustainable finance. 54 countries. Arguably the biggest impact opportunities in the world, we have one university. It's like being in the US, the biggest car in market, and you have one car manufacturer. University of Cape Town. It's embarrassing for us as Africans. We'll not advance if we don't have people who understand how to bridge this gap. We'll not advance if our governments, for example, will not understand the kind of policies they need to create to enable innovative financing to thrive. And Claude will tell you some of the things that just come up when you're trying to do innovative financing structures are just very outdated policies that don't keep up with the times. The good thing though about being in Africa is the glass is no longer half empty, it's half full. What were 10, 15 years ago, embarrassing problems are phenomenal impact opportunities today. And if you're an impact player, you've got to be in Africa. This is where you have to play. And if you heard me talk before, I always call Africa the Wembley of impact. Because you have enough and a diverse range of challenges to try products, to innovate. Because this is all a new learning space for many of us. These innovative financing models, we're all learning as we speak. But we need philanthropists to be able to fund that innovation that gives us the next idea that will scale impact. And that's why it's so important for us as philanthropists to start thinking of ourselves. And I'm not saying we walk away from traditional philanthropy. There's certain things that need traditional philanthropy, but increasingly we've got to ask ourselves, are we being catalytic? Are we bringing in more money and more impact that our money in absolute terms can deliver? And so one of the things we're doing, we're going to be rolling out a catalytic investment training program in September, and highly encourage as many of you as possible to sign up. It's going to be $100, it's not expensive to sign up for the program. But we need to start thinking differently as philanthropists in the country, and that includes governments, because the biggest grant makers in the country are governments. Just to close, I was very impressed. I went to a conference in Thailand last year, and the Minister of Finance was talking, and his first slide that he put up, he says, as the Thai government of Thailand, we now see ourselves as catalytic investors, not as a government. That was the Minister of Finance. Because they realize the money they have is not enough to solve their problems, and they need to think about how do they catalyze in more capital, especially from the private sector.
Thank you. I'll start because I'm going to you next, Chloe. I mean, we've heard from Arif and Dr. Frank as well about shifting mindsets and the move from funding to financing. And I think sometimes when people hear about impact bonds and all the various instruments, it becomes a bit complicated for those who are not involved. And what I wanted you to touch on is how can institutions who want to deploy this financing mechanism as an intentional strategy approach this? What are some of the best practices in designing and implementing approaches so that they can be sustainable outcomes and longer term impact? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I think totally agree. I think there's been a real, what I would call sort of productization of the sector, and we hear all these acronyms of DIBs and SIBs and SINKs, and it's very confusing and quite alienating. So I think for me what's really important is to remind ourselves that the core of everything is the impact that we want to achieve, and the structure that sits around that is nothing more than the structure. It should be enabling and it should be supportive, but it shouldn't add extra complication, and at its very heart we should be focusing on the outcomes rather than the acronym, and I would really encourage everybody to keep that in mind. I would also say, I think Frank mentioned this earlier, that I don't think outcomes-based approaches are suitable for everything that we're trying to do. I think, at best they can be a highly effective tool for delivering change, but at worst they can be incredibly expensive and a waste of scarce resources. So I think in terms of best practices and the way that we think about whether or not an outcomes-based approach is suitable, we generally start with 3 questions. And the first is, is there a clear outcome that we can all agree on that is good? And in some sectors, that's pretty obvious. A job is an outcome that a lot of us spend time thinking about, but in other sectors, that's perhaps slightly more complicated. How do we measure and verify female economic empowerment? What's an easy way of doing that? That might not exist, or that might be highly complex. I think the other thing that we think about is there space for change, and is there room for adaptive performance management? If an intervention is the best, if we know that the way that the intervention is currently being delivered is the best and the only way to do it, then I think some of these complex structures are perhaps not that helpful, and grant funding is, I think, the most likely way to go. And then I think finally, in increasing, and you touched on sustainability in your question, Marianne, that when we're thinking about sustainability, and as Frank said earlier, the government is a key part in all of this. And again, perhaps not relevant everywhere, but in many sectors, the government, we should be thinking about how best to include the government. And so I think outcomes-based approaches can be a really interesting way of doing that, because they de-risk the cost of an intervention for a government, because they're only paying for success. So perhaps just before I wrap up, I can share an example of how that's happened. We mentioned earlier the KMC Development Impact Bond in Cameroon, and the Ministry of Health was there's an outcomes funder there, which enabled them to pay for a new way of delivering neonatal services that they hadn't delivered before, but only on an impact basis. And at the end of the 2.5 years of the Development Impact Bond, it was very short, the Ministry of Health has seen up front that this is a highly cost-effective, highly impactful way of delivering care to premature newborn babies. And so for the first time ever, they created a budget just for KMC rollout to further scale up across Cameroon. And they also integrated some of the outcomes metrics that we were using into their existing healthcare framework. And I think that when I think about sustainability, that's really the outcome that I'm looking for. They no longer need external funding to be able to deliver that care. And I see a lot of these complex mechanisms or acronyms as being a sort of pathway to achieving that.
Thank you. I want you to keep on, to stay with the mic, because I want you to keep the conversation going a little bit, Chloe. Dr. Frank touched on innovation, and could you tell us a little bit about how can results-based financing then be leveraged to incentivize that kind of innovation that we want to see in the continent, and collaboration, and also ensuring that those interventions, lead to system change?
Sure, happy to. So in terms of innovation, in their most simplest form, results-based financing essentially moves away from funding specific activities or inputs and towards funding for outcomes. And what that does is it gives the service provider or the implementing organisation a lot more freedom to sort of trial and adapt and see what works, because they're not tied to a log frame, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but instead they're accountable only for the results that they achieve. And I've seen that in quite tangible ways create space for innovation that I think would have been challenging in other contexts. So for instance, again, throwing back to the example I mentioned earlier, under COVID, we had to totally pivot the way of delivering this service and try where possible to do remote service delivery or telemedicine. I think under a log frame that would have been quite difficult. We would have had to ask for donor approval to change how we did that. But because we just agreed on the outcomes, that change happened over the course of 3 days, which I personally have never seen before. I think in terms of collaboration as well, it can be a really exciting tool. So one thing outcomes-based approaches do really well is define shared outcomes or shared definitions of success. And so a good example of that is we recently launched a development impact bond in Cambodia. It's the first development impact bond that looks at both demining and agriculture. And what we've done that's really neat is one of the outcomes metrics essentially forces collaboration between those two sectors. Service providers only get paid based on increased agricultural revenues from demined lands. And so one cannot be done without the other, and I think that's a really interesting incentive to collaborate. And then finally, on the evidence-based part of your question, Mariam, again, another interesting element of outcomes-based financing is that you have to measure as you go and constantly track what you're achieving, and therefore you're inherently creating an evidence base. And it's quite easy at the end of a program to be able to say, this worked and this didn't. And that was a big part of our argument for the example I mentioned earlier with the Ministry of Health of Cameroon. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, we have a bit of a thing going on with the mics and need to make sure Arif speaks next here. Arif, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
We want to go back again on partnerships. You touched on it a little bit in the beginning when you're talking about making sure that there's trust and how we can create the right partnerships. And I know you've worked a lot on public-private partnerships and also blended finance as a strategy. So maybe you could also expound on that a little bit and tell us what are some of the critical factors to consider and what leads to a successful collaboration between public and private sectors and driving impact that's transformative. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Miriam. And we've had one very interesting experience. Currently, we're in the process of launching the world's first, we like to think, development impact bond for adolescent sexual reproductive health for 500,000 adolescent girls to access services in 300 public facilities across 10 subnational governments, counties in Kenya. And this is both a window for outcome funding as well as a window for investors who negotiate a pre-agreed minimum rate of return. And looking at the kinds of discussions and negotiations we've gone through, it's been very clear that if we can have these kind of common outcomes and common metrics that Chloe spoke about, and bring the Ministry of Health closer to this approach. It was initially led by SIF, and eventually we brought in 3 UN agencies, the WHO, UNFPA, and UNAIDS, and private sector implementers rigorous. We have now a government partner who is very keen to see that this is indeed an effective and practical way of delivering adolescent sexual reproductive health, in which case the design is to then embed the bond in the next phase in the Ministry of Health itself, and for the Ministry itself to lock in some level of budgeting under its medium-term expenditure framework. But these kinds of approaches, bringing in private sector, philanthropy, and government, have certain sort of critical, I think, success factors here. One is that we need to align very fully the national priorities and aspirations that also reflect the SDG goals that we all committed to. We have less than 7.5 years left, as we know. And we need to be seen as pulling together across all sectors. The second one is deepening trust. I think this factor of trust is extremely important. It's something that needs to go beyond transactional relationships to real deep relationships also with private sector. This is not about CSR, 2% on the side. This is not about, asking a partner to come for lunch and open up the void between main course and dessert. This is about co-creating those solutions across all these multi-stakeholders, including philanthropy and private sector. The third one is really aligning incentives, making sure that there's enlightened self-interest for every sector and partner coming in, so that it's a win-win right from inception. Everyone's perspectives and objectives and incentives are often different. And if we can align them around a common framework and a common outcome, which creates this win-win, then you automatically get this multi-stakeholder block to work together. A common, credible, transparent, and neutral partner is a backbone to this kind of approach, is also critical. For us, it's the SDG partnership platform, but in the wider sense, there are many other philanthropic compacts that have served to be in the backbone for these kinds of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And then widening the ownership of initiatives across partners is very important because we need to challenge a lot of the global partners on their pooled funding commitments. Many of them make global commitments, but haven't translated those into common pooled funding approaches on the ground, but have tended to do their own thing with their own individual branding. So some of these pooled funding approaches have been particularly powerful in bringing partners together and driving a common set of outcomes that we're looking for. The next one is really about harnessing TA, technical assistance, transaction advisory, the intellectual firepower, whether you get it in the UN agencies, you get it in academia, you get it in foundations. But we need to harness the right TA at the right time. So it's not just about money. We really need those smart solutions and the intellectual partnerships. And then to make sure that we're bringing in early wins and concrete examples of investments and partnerships that hit the ground and create concrete impact that we can measure. Because ultimately, everything relies on the success of impacts on the ground. Everything else is simply a means to an end. So we really need to be keeping the prize in mind in terms of very concrete impacts on the ground. I'll stop there and happy to answer further questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. I think also, Dr. Frank, you bring in a different, I know there are a lot of similarities also with what Arif said, but if for the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, you look at the whole ecosystem, right, from a borrower's lens to an investor lens to a philanthropy lens. And the shift also needs to happen with CSOs also play a critical role in our society and in the continent. Maybe to also add from your experience how to bring together those kind of partnerships.
Yeah, I think there is an increasing realization that we can't solve a lot of the problems on our own, and a lot of organizations are asking themselves some hard questions. So you've gone into a community to solve a food security problem, and you're there 20 years later. Something's not right. You can't maintain your job for 20 years when the purpose was for you to go solve the problem, enable the community to do whatever it needs to do, and you move out and go solve the next problem. So we need to start thinking about what are the things we need to do differently to really stretch our resources as far as they can, because there's less and less against a growing number of problems for us to solve. And so we're seeing a huge increase in openness to collaboration. Someone this morning, I think on the panel that Sean was leading, was talking about the need to break down silos. I think we're seeing a lot more private players and philanthropy wanting to collaborate a lot more. The concept of pool funds is growing. We've got a number of foundations who are coming to us and telling us we don't have enough resources. Who can we put our money together with so we can do more as a collective than on our own? So the reality is with us at the moment, and we need to be thinking. However, in doing that, you also have to ask to be very clear on a few basic things. What does success look like for the partnership? What are the risks you're willing to take? What do you also want to add to the body of knowledge? So for example, I've got this one philanthropist who was giving out $1 million each year to a group of 40 women groups who are kind of running small businesses. And so we told him, okay, so let's think about sustainability. What happens to them if you die tomorrow? You know, where will they get the next $1 million to distribute to these guys? So we told him, let's try something different. And this was us pushing him towards his appetite for innovation and for bit of risk. So we told him, take that $1 million, put it in a bank as a loan guarantee facility, and let the bank lend these women money on concessional rates. He was originally very reluctant, and he thought, oh no, you know, they're not used to borrowing money. We told him, no, just let's try this. 15 months later, these groups had borrowed 2-3 times. Their assets had grown by 400%, 2 to 400%, and only one group had defaulted. And that one group is because majority of the members were men. So many times we go into these investments wanting to create almost a culture of dependence on our people. It's like the longer we stay with them, the better it makes us feel. And we really have to be asking ourselves about going in, being catalytic, and exiting. Now, it's not in every particular project, I do agree. There's certain things like you're doing an old people's home or an ECD center, that needs a grant. You got to go and do that for them. But certain things, let's not go into the assumption that these people don't have the pride of doing it for themselves. So our job should be thinking really catalytically at all points in time. How are we going to enable these people to take care of themselves and address the problems themselves? And find the sustainability model that works best for that particular problem. Okay? That's something I really want us to push ourselves. And another thing I want us to force ourselves, think about a 2x2 matrix. Sorry, this is people who've done an MBA will know this one. And on one axis, you've got willingness to pay, high and low. Another one, ability to pay, high and low. Okay? And in one, depending on these quadrants, you'll be thinking there's one where there's high willingness to pay, low ability to pay. And where there's willingness to pay and high ability to pay, don't go into the grant mechanism. People just want an affordable, good service. Let a social enterprise set up and provide service to the community. It's more sustainable that way. They need a grant. Let's not make assumptions that, people want us in those communities to stay for long, and no. There's too many problems to solve. Get in, catalyze the solution, get out.
Thank you. And I think that it's the examples that's really bringing the conversation to life for all of us. At least I hope so. Chloe, maybe just to in that spirit of keeping the conversation around maybe some specific examples or approaches, for example, on lessons that you've taken from initiatives that you've had. Be good for people to also hear more about that. Yes.
In general, or anything specific?
Yeah, just specifically what has worked for you in your work that other players can then also take on board.
Sure. I mean, I'm guessing most people in this room are familiar with the good old theory of change, which I think has been a tool used by a lot of us in this community, and some people like it more than others, but I personally found it really helpful. And I think when we start working, particularly with service providers, but also with philanthropic organisations, to start just with that simple theory of change, which most people will have to hand, and think about where are you focusing and where is funding coming in within that. And I think in general, funding comes in, and for the majority of cases, at the inputs or the activities part. So if you picture your theory of change of sort of, you're going inputs, activities, outputs, outcome, impact, generally, and you can start wherever you want, but by mapping that and then figuring out where your money is coming in, I guess I'd encourage people, and I think this has worked really well, to think about how you could move further to that, towards that impact end of the theory of change. And I think that is both for service providers, but also for grant makers as well. So if you're funding people, for example, to deliver a training, or to deliver, for instance, if you're funding TVET training for unemployed youth, and that's what you're funding on, can you challenge yourself to think about, okay, how would we fund based on people in jobs, and move one step further towards the overall impact? And for me, I think that's a really helpful starting place before you get into the sort of technicality of the various cash flows and the contracting structure. Just thinking, how can we move further towards impact, and what does that look like for us, is a really helpful conversation.
Arif, I'll come to you on a similar question. So, trying to make this conversation as practical as possible. So, are there any lessons or specific examples on approaches that you can share that other players can also adopt?
Yeah, thank you. I think driving catalytic financing approaches through multi-stakeholder platforms. I guess some of the lessons we've learned is A, align to national priorities, ensure that we align incentives and put the partnerships accordingly for win-wins, develop pooled funding instruments, multi-partner trust funds, for example, drive early wins and build trust through common achievements, give everyone maximum credit. It's amazing what you can achieve in life if you give everyone the credit for credit. So make sure all your multi-stakeholder partners get the full visibility of whatever is achieved. Build requisite capacity for innovative financing investments. I think oftentimes we shortchange ourselves on capacity. This is a different type of capacity from the old model of grants in and grants out. So let's build that sophisticated capacity. Focus on sustaining the longer-term systems change beyond short-term political and funding cycles. We oftentimes trap ourselves in short-term grant cycles and short-term political cycles. It's the next election, it's the next governor, it's the next head of board. But how do we go beyond these short-term cycles to create more sustainable financing approaches? And I think these have been some of the lessons that we've learned, in addition to full transparency and accountability, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. I know Dr. Frank, you've also shared quite a bit, but maybe just if you have anything to add also on any learnings, you can share that as well. Thank you.
I think the other thing I want to add is just we need to have the desire and mindset of experimenting and learning. The private sector startup space does that very well. And in the development space, we've never been that experimental. When we're very safe in how we do things. And to get out of and have leapfrog improvements in the input or delivery, we've got to take some risks. And as I repeat again, no one is in a better position to take risks than a philanthropist. Your money is the only one that has the appetite for risk. We've got to have a bit of an appetite for risk. That's number one. Number two, when you're thinking about solutions, be very open to look outside your country, even outside your continent, especially the other global south regions. So I've just, as I mentioned, we have a sister network in Asia. I've just come from Malaysia now from the annual conference, and it's the biggest impact conference in Asia. And you know, it's interesting how we had two ministers from two different countries. And as they talk about their priorities, the first in each of the priorities, there's a common thread about this is our skills development framework for the next 20 years. This is the kind of competence we need for the next 20 years. They're thinking about how do you build the manpower that will drive this economy going forward. But they also, and in both cases, they both spoke about the need to innovate. And governments are funding huge innovative initiatives. We've got to get ourselves out of the rut as we speak. So I think that's the second thing. The third thing is we'll always be better off working with others than doing it alone. And it's an issue of finding who are the right partners for you to work with and be deliberate about collaboration. And don't be scared to try and fail. And you never go into these things thinking, I'm doing this thing, but what if I fail? Is what if you succeed? What if you bring in if you succeed? How much more can people learn? And on the Mastercard Foundation Africa Growth Fund, for example, it's a $200 million fund with a gender that's investing. And we take risks in that fund because the foundation has allowed us to take risks. They say, go and fund models that would shift Africa. So for example, you find someone who lends women, like the biggest issue women have to access credit is that they don't have collateral. Most women are not allowed to own land, that kind of stuff. So you go to a bank will give you money. But people are testing models like revenue share models, where you pay based on the revenue you make. If you make a lot of money, you pay more. If you make less, you pay less. That enables the cycles of capital to fall in sync with what your debt repayments are. So there's plenty out there. Okay? We have to just figure out how do we get to understand what is happening.
Thank you. I hope that this has triggered questions, contributions. There's a lot of experience also in the room. I know there are actors who are passionate about localization as well and unlocking local capital, which is really important when it comes to innovative financing. So I think we will take a couple of questions from the room on contributions. Okay, now I'm not sure who raised their hand first. Maybe we can start from the back going forward. So we have, there's someone who will take the mic round? Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you everybody that has, all the panelists that have shared. I guess sometimes when we talk about systems change, that word might possibly mean various things to various people based on where you sit in the ecosystem or in the system. So I want to just talk about systems change from my vantage point or from where I sit in this system. So in one of roles, I serve as an advisor to an impact investment firm based in Kampala, and this is what I've seen. There are many NGOs or organizations that were traditionally NGOs that are stepping into the impact investment space and connecting with venture philanthropy, mostly because they're trying to build their own capital to do their own private capital to do development work. But this is what happens. While it's absolutely true that that this kind of capital is the one that's most, I guess, drawn towards risk, I think that many times when, I've over time grown to believe that many times when impact investors say this, that they are drawn towards risk and that they are looking for exciting innovation solutions, really what they mean is that they are looking for mature impact investment businesses that have been around for a while. That's the first. The second is that when they finally found these mature impact investment enterprises, they forget sometimes the conversations that involve investment, they forget that these enterprises have been around for several years, and the investor who probably their financial investment is a fraction of what has already been invested, that fraction comes with a certain amount of power that just doesn't make sense given everything that has already gone into this enterprise. The other is that when they finally decide that, okay, this is something that we want to invest in, what I've seen a lot is that many African entrepreneurs who are trying to solve social problems, they tend to be overcoached and underfunded. It's almost as though the individuals or organizations that want to contribute to this space, their first instinct is, let's coach you before we fund you. I'm going to wrap up. Granted, where there's capital, there's power. I think that that's something that if you work in this sector, you've already come to terms with. But a lot of that power, it's not the presence of that power that we stand against, it's how that power has been abused and how that power has been used, I think, within the impact investment space. All these to deliver two questions. My first question is, sometimes I can't read my own handwriting. When I landed here in Zanzibar, I saw that the majority of tuk-tuk drivers were men. So it's clear to me that there must be something systemic around that industry that leads it to be a male-dominated sector. When I think about the conservation and luxury hotel, luxury lodge investments in Africa, most of them tend to be white-owned. So it seems to me that there's also something rather systemic about that particular sector. When we think about impact, many times we tend to think of the quantitative stuff, number of jobs, number of X services delivered. Is the impact investment space thinking about certain soft problems such as racism and the impact investors that play in that area? Are those solutions, are those problems that impact investors are thinking about solving? Then lastly, is there such a thing as an impact lender, or when we say impact investors, we also mean impact lenders? I hope these questions make sense.
Thank you very much, Madam and the panelists. I'm Georgine Kenye from Cameroon, working with the African Gender and Extractive Alliance. I was really very touched by all your presentation and input. And now my question, basically not a question or the reflection I'm having, because what Dr. Frank was saying and also what Chloe was putting about, the innovation and also, how it's possible basically to get funding and to change the system, or basically to promote what women at the grassroots level are doing. We are working with women in the community, but now they are not accessing funding. Those women who have been impacted by mining, so they don't have funding. They don't know that the funding Dr. Frank has been speaking about exists, how they can access that fund, and they do not have, some of them do not have access to the smartphone to know what is happening. And some of them may not know how to use the smartphone. how can we connect these together and make sure that those women who need funding and who are doing the right work, you know, like defending their livelihood and equally taking care of the environment, are getting access to those funding. Thank you so much.
My question is really simple. I work with a fund in Uganda that supports women, youth, and children. And Dr. Greg talked a lot about how philanthropists no one is in a better position to make financial risks than philanthropists. And I might have missed it, but I'm just curious why that is.
So why philanthropists are better placed to take risks?
Yes.
I'll try and answer the first and third question together. So there's a couple of things. One, when you think about any business starts at an idea stage, and it goes into a life cycle of seed stage, and it grows, it acquires its first customer, it starts making revenue, probably it's not making profit, so on and so forth, until it becomes a mature business. In that early stage, when it's still either pre-revenue or it's still starting, your more commercial investors like banks are not going to touch it because you're too risky. You don't have a track record, you've not maybe even had a year of books, accounting books to demonstrate that you're a viable business. And they always talk about the first 1,000 days of any business. And that early phase is where we need philanthropy. Because philanthropy can take a bit more risk in that process. And the joy about today is that the way philanthropy is deployed has also changed. In places where you put in early stage financing to philanthropy, it doesn't mean it has to go in necessarily as a grant that will go and not come back. There's instruments like convertible instruments. You can give it in as a grant, and if the business succeeds, it gets converted to a debt or an equity. So you get your money back. And this is why knowledge is very important in this innovative financing space. It's opened up so many doors for us. Don't just think grants and debts anymore. There's a lot of instruments in between here that you need to start learning about. So convertible instruments can give you as a foundation a really interesting thing. The guy was talking about the $1 million over a 5-year period. Traditionally, he'd have used $5 million. He used $1 million because that fund was a revolving fund. So there's so much innovation happening. To the gentleman at the back, I'm going to try and summarize the question in the following. Every business or every investment delivers impact, but not every business is impact investing.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you the difference. Okay? There are two things that separate impact investing from just normal impact. One, do you have additionality? Are you creating more jobs? Are you giving access to water? Are you solving social issues in the context of doing your business or your investment? Number two is intentionality. Is private capital going where on its own it would not go? Okay? When you're making a decision between building a factory in Nairobi or in the middle of Turkana in the northern Kenya, the incentive you have to take the factory out of Nairobi, that incentive is what adds intentionality to your thing. You're going to create jobs where they're most needed. In Nairobi or Kampala or Dar es Salaam, yes, jobs are needed, but not as badly as they need in the rural areas, for example. And what philanthropy also gives you as early stage partners is it gives you the power of choice. You can influence the kind of jobs you want to be created based on the investment you're making. You can tell this person that you're funding, you will make sure that 50% of the jobs are for women and girls. You have that power. Okay? I know I'm cutting a long story short, and I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation, but in essence, there is so much power that philanthropy has now to change how the world is structured. And that's why you see there's a huge growth in gender-led investing at the moment. Huge.
Thanks, Dr. Frank. Maybe just quickly to add to that, and starting with the question around how we can encourage women who may not know about all of this to be able to access these types of investment. I think somebody at the opening plenary mentioned sort of mapping all of the different stakeholders that exist within your world. And I would suggest that's probably a good place to start. So I agree, there's a huge distance between some of the things that we're talking about and perhaps some of the stakeholders that you work with. But I think if you were to start by, okay, who do these women engage with? Do they engage with banks? What's the barriers there? What other access to capital do they have? What assets do they have? Is there any sort of easily accessible saving schemes that they can access, and where do they sit? Is that with the private sector? Is that with the government? Is that with the financial sector? And I think maybe starting from there to then think about how you can join those different stakeholders up with the type of financing that we're talking about here today. And I suspect, again, that's probably a longer conversation, but that's probably where I would start. And then maybe just to add to what Frank was saying in response to the question about kind of investment or impact-oriented investment in Africa specifically, I think that for a long time, and perhaps for not very reliable or objective reasons, there's a high level of perceived risk in investing in this area. And I think that's perhaps why we see exactly what you just described, which is people saying we want impact, we want to do something that's really risky, and actually we end up sort of, capital flows to the path of least resistance in many instances. And I think that's a really interesting space for philanthropy, and things like a first loss guarantee. If you could say, okay, if you're worried about investing in this, what you perceive to be a high risk area, how about I take half of your losses if you have any? And I think that's a really interesting way and simple way of catalysing investment and de-risking what is perceived to be high risk.
I'll give you an example. There's a business, and I can send it to as many as possible. There's a business in Mexico City that was providing diabetes healthcare in Mexico, in the city peripheral areas, especially to low-end people in the city. It was doing really, really well. And then they wanted them to expand into the rural areas, and the guy said it's too risky. We can't go to the rural areas, there's no business model to do that. Someone said, okay, I will fund your risk. Okay? I will give you money to go and test your model in the rural areas. On condition that if you succeed, you scale it with your own money. And someone gave them $300,000. They went, they hired people, built some additional clinics, and they found that actually with a few tweaks they could make the model work. And they then invested private capital in the expansion. And the catalytic investor, who was a philanthropist, then pulled out. He had catalyzed the move, he had de-risked that move. So that's what I'm saying. There is so many new opportunities today on how capital can magnify impact, and especially philanthropic capital.
I think we have two people here who will come to take questions here.
My name is Wilfred Habiola from Social Justice Centers in Kenya. And my question is, or my comments is, are we willing also to have a discussion on how these resources are used, especially within the region? As someone who works in slums and informal settlements, I get shocked when I hear 40 billion came to Africa. But in terms of impact, just an example of this meeting. The local community here, do they even know there's a meeting like this? Do they feel the impact? When we came from the airport to the hotel on Saturday, hotel to the airport, the amount of money that will be spent in this conference. What if we told people, we'll give you money for accommodation, get your own accommodation and meals, dinner? What will that impact the local women we are talking about in this room? So the question is, are we willing to even disrupt the way this money, you'll find that 40 billion, 20 goes to such facilities by the same capitalists we are trying to fight. But if we cannot change that discussion, you find that in Africa, people don't give to philanthropy. Because when they see me or they see me in Zanzibar in a fancy hotel, tomorrow you want me to go and say, can you help the work that I do on gender-based violence? They say, but, So for me, we must also change, as we change the system, we must also change the system of civil society and NGO engagements in the communities. That 40 billion, at least 25 billion should impact communities around Africa. And that impact should be seen, rather than when they see you, it's hotel. We must also change the way we do our businesses and our accountability structure. You want to work in the community, but you need an LPO. Where will our local women get LPOs? Yet they have the best food. So how are we disrupting even the sector so that we have more impact in the work that we do? We must think about the church concept. Every Sunday, someone goes and gives. They are very poor, but they're giving their 10 shillings with peace. What do churches do that we don't do? And if we have to think about local fundraising, because with local fundraising, you'll not be told that there's war in Ukraine, so there will be less funding. People will give knowing that they are giving towards a change that they believe in and they are part of. Thank you.
Okay, so I was going to make a similar comment, but I was going to call it development tourism that we invest in. But anyway, but I wanted to just ask a question, Chloe and Frank, because you mentioned a lot about results and impact, etc. And so from a CSO perspective, wanting to get in into impact investing, is the onus on us to demonstrate the return, the social return on investment, and how we actually do that?
Thank you so much. My name is Willis Onyaga, and I'm the director at the Youth Cafe, which is a Pan-Africa Youth Empowerment Movement. My question is first to Frank. Oftentimes when we hear impact investment, and you mentioned the MBA classes, the case studies or the examples cited are not from Africa. They are from North America, they are from Europe, they are from Asia, with the emergence of BRAC, for instance, and Grameen Bank as models. So through the African Venture Philanthropy Alliance, what are some of the interesting examples that you can cite that this was a venture fund by African, funded to an African social venture, and what are the results? And then I think in the remarks and the comments there was a bit of an interlinkage between what the traditional philanthropy can do or is already doing vis-a-vis what they can learn from social impact investment. But what practical, let's say, two attributes that can be borrowed from social investing that can enrich traditional philanthropy without an overhaul of the system, because I don't think that would be possible. For instance, when it is social investing, you have to come up with a business plan. In philanthropy, you have to write a proposal. These are two different tracks. So how do they meet in between? And it is also great that you mentioned learning. In the learning tracks, social investment is learned differently to, let's say, philanthropy as completely two distinct paths. Thank you.
Okay. So I've been told that we're short of time. Yes, so we'll take those three questions. So to the gentleman there about the intentionality of us being conscious of impact we're having on a day-to-day basis, I agree with you. I think we've got to think about where were these baskets sourced from, for example. Who did you buy them from? The lanyards that our names are holding, who did you get them from? So we should always be very conscious of the stuff that we do. And once again, a lot of these decisions are in our power. We can make these decisions in our own organizations. So it's really up to us to decide where are we going to be a lot more conscious in stuff that's within our control to do that kind of stuff. And it's in everyday decisions we make. I can't emphasize that enough that, when you decide you're going to buy groceries, are you buying from a female shopkeeper to a male shopkeeper? Those things like that. I think it's all within our power. On the issue about African stories, you're totally correct. As I told you, we don't have schools in Africa. There are about 120 and 125 global business schools that teach impact and sustainable finance. We have one in Africa. Okay, so in fact, we've got a program we're working on at the moment. Please check out this organization an association called the Impact and Sustainable Finance Consortium Faculty. Okay, Impact and Sustainable Finance Consortium Faculty. It's a group of about 125 global business schools that teach the subject. All your usual suspects, your Ivy League schools, Oxford, Cambridge, so on and so forth. They formed an association that was founded by a grant from Rockefeller. And one of the joys being part of the consortium that all the curriculum and research is made open source. You can teach anywhere using Harvard curriculum so long as you're part of the consortium. There's not a single African business school in that consortium. Okay, so we've been working with them. We've developed an 8-module train-the-trainer curriculum. We've worked on it for about 12-15 months now. And we are looking for funding to recruit about 50 African business schools to take them through this program with a view that after they've done the program, they can set up their departments of impact and sustainable finance. Then we can do everything at scale locally. We can do case study development like you're talking. Because the impact case studies are sitting in Asia. They're not in Europe or the US. In fact, what they're complaining about and why they need it with us is they need content to teach. Okay? But we need to be deliverable. So there's a program we're looking to do those capabilities and stuff. And then what can philanthropists do? For starters, I think a very simple thing you can do is try and think which problem you can solve differently. One that you battle to solve. And how can you solve it differently with one or two other people? So you share risk and you aggregate resources. Who can you bring together that you can try something different? On a platform where you each put money in a pot, for example, and just try something different. And it could be something as simple as far as I told you, a loan guarantee facility or funding a social enterprise locally that supplies schools or something on a food scheme program. So there's so many things you can do. And because I don't know the context of all your problems that you're solving in detail, that's the kind of stuff you can do. And then examples of funds that are delivering impact, there is many, despite the fact that the space is quite young. And that's why it's exciting, because we're all learning. They're not giants, we're just all tall dwarfs. We're all learning. Okay? Do not feel that the guy next to you knows any more than you do. So don't feel that you cannot go out there and learn and try stuff. That's how we're going to learn. Okay? So there's plenty of venture funds that are starting to do stuff, but I don't think many of them are going to the point of, for example, they're exiting some of their investments and stuff. But there's definitely good momentum and good traction. And we're seeing from the funders who fund these investors' vehicles, more and more of them are demanding impact in their outcome, not just money to be made. They're saying, okay, I want to make returns, but what impact are you having? That is a trend, and it's been driven by two crises, just in conclusion. Black Lives Matter and the COVID crisis. We're seeing a big change in investors saying, my money cannot just give me money, it returns back, it's got to do more.
I'm so sorry, I know we are out of time and I'm getting lots of messages to end the session, and I know there are particularly the two people at the front who had questions, but maybe the best way we approach it, because we're going for tea now, we could continue the conversation outside this room. I hope this has sparked further thinking in terms of what can be done or what we can do differently. I hope you leave here inspired. So thank you very much for your time listening and engaging. Thank you to our very knowledgeable and esteemed panelists, Chloe, Dr. Frank, and Arif, who continue to engage in this space. So please do interact with them as we go for tea. You can ask the questions, we can continue the conversation. But I think we need to give ourselves a round of applause for staying this long. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening. Tea is served outside, same place, and see you soon. Thank you. Bye.